There is a moment in tennis history that doesn't get talked about nearly as much as it should. Novak Djokovic, world number 1, 7-time Grand Slam champion, at the peak of his powers, walking off a court in Doha having just lost to a 35-year-old journeyman who most casual fans had never heard of. The man's name was Ivo Karlovic. He stood 6 feet 11 inches tall, and for nearly 2 decades, he was the single most physically imposing, genuinely unsolvable puzzle that men's tennis has ever produced. This isn't a story about a rivalry, in the traditional sense. Karlovic never won a Grand Slam. He never reached a major final. By almost every conventional measure, his career doesn't belong in the same conversation as Djokovic's. And yet, somehow, this towering Croatian beat Djokovic not once, but twice, including once when Djokovic was ranked world number 1, in peak form, seemingly untouchable by anyone in the sport. How does a player with no signature trophy, no career-defining rivalry, no place in tennis's traditional Hall of Legends, end up being one of the very few men who could walk onto a court and make even the greatest player of his generation look genuinely uncomfortable? The answer starts not with technique or tactics or years of elite academy training. It starts with something far simpler and far rarer, a body that tennis, as a sport, had simply never had to deal with before. Ivo Karlovic was born in Zagreb, Croatia, and by the time he reached his late teens, it was already clear his body was going to be unlike almost anyone else's in professional tennis. He grew to 6 feet 11 inches tall, not just tall for a tennis player, but tall in a way that made him, for most of his career, the tallest player the ATP Tour had ever officially recorded. That height came with obvious advantages and equally obvious problems. On one hand, it gave him a serve release point that no coach could ever teach, no training program could ever replicate, and no opponent could ever fully prepare for. On the other hand, a frame that size isn't naturally built for the quick lateral movement, explosive changes of direction, and grinding baseline rallies that define most of modern tennis. Karlovic was never going to out-rally the best players in the world. His entire career had to be built around one singular weapon instead. A serve so massive, so difficult to read, that it could single-handedly neutralize almost any opponent's game plan before a rally even had the chance to begin. He turned professional in the late 1990s, and it took years of grinding through the lower levels of the tour before he became a household name in tennis circles. His breakthrough moment arrived in 2003, when he stunned Lleyton Hewitt, at the time, the reigning Wimbledon champion and world number 1, in the first round of Wimbledon itself. It was an upset that immediately put the tennis world on notice. This towering, unconventional player wasn't just a physical curiosity. He was a legitimate threat to anyone in the draw, on the right surface, on the right day. From there, Karlovic carved out a career that looked nothing like a typical top player's resume. He never cracked the top 10 in the world rankings for any extended stretch. He built his reputation not on Grand Slam runs, but on being one of the most dangerous floor-level threats in the sport. A player ranked outside the elite tier who could nonetheless walk onto any court, against any opponent, and win purely off the strength of a single, overwhelming shot. And Djokovic, of all players, felt that threat directly. Their first meeting came in Doha in 2009, at the Qatar Open, with Djokovic entering as the top seed and reigning world number 1, playing through windy, difficult conditions that only made Karlovic's serve harder to read. The towering Croatian pulled off the upset, firing down over 20 aces and eliminating Djokovic in a tight 3-set battle. It wasn't a fluke either. Karlovic beat Djokovic again on hard courts in the years that followed, finishing his career with a winning record in their head-to-head series against one of the greatest players the sport has ever produced. To understand why Karlovic was so uniquely difficult for even the greatest players in the world to solve, you have to understand exactly what his height did to the physics of a tennis serve. The average professional server releases the ball from somewhere around 9 or 10 feet off the ground. Karlovic, with his 6'11" frame and full extension on the toss, released his serve from a point noticeably higher than almost anyone else in the sport's history. That extra height changed everything about how the ball traveled. It meant a flatter trajectory over the net, a steeper downward angle into the service box, and dramatically less margin for error for the returner trying to read where the ball was actually going. Opponents weren't just facing a fast serve. They were facing a serve traveling at an angle their eyes and instincts, trained on thousands of more conventional service motions, simply weren't built to track. That's the technical explanation, but the psychological effect was arguably even more significant. Facing Karlovic meant walking onto the court already knowing that the normal rules of a tennis match, the back-and-forth rhythm of holding serve, building pressure over a long rally, wearing an opponent down physically, simply didn't apply the way they usually did. Entire sets could pass with almost no meaningful baseline exchanges at all, just a relentless procession of unreturnable serves, forcing opponents into a version of tennis that rewarded patience, mental composure, and above all, the ability to stay sharp during long stretches where they barely touched the ball. For a player like Djokovic, someone whose entire game was built on elite return skills, on grinding opponents down through relentless rallies, on reading and dismantling an opponent's patterns over the course of a match, Karlovic represented a genuine style clash unlike almost anything else on tour. There was no pattern to read because there was barely a rally to build one from. There was no way to wear him down physically through extended baseline exchanges because those exchanges rarely happened. The match became, in a very real sense, a coin flip decided by a handful of return points and tiebreaks, where even the smallest margins could tip an entire match in the Giants' favor. That's precisely what happened in Doha. Windy, tricky conditions made Karlovic's already difficult serve even harder to track, and Djokovic, for all his elite return skills, simply couldn't generate enough breakpoint opportunities to overcome it. It wasn't a story of Djokovic playing badly, it was a story of facing a genuinely unique physical outlier, on a day where that outlier's singular weapon was firing on all cylinders. Karlovic's impact on tennis went well beyond his individual results against elite players like Djokovic. Over the course of his career, he became one of the most prolific ace servers the sport has ever seen, finishing among the all-time leaders in total career aces, a record built match after match, year after year, largely off the strength of that one singular, unreplicable weapon. But his legacy carries a deeper significance for how the sport thinks about physical outliers. Before Karlovic, and players like John Isner who followed a somewhat similar path, tennis had never really been forced to grapple with just how disruptive extreme height could be at the elite level. Karlovic proved, definitively, that a player without conventional elite movement, without a complete all-court game, without the kind of well-rounded resume that usually defines the sport's greatest names, could still consistently trouble, and occasionally beat, the very best players in the world, purely through one dominant physical advantage executed at an elite level. That legacy shaped how coaches and analysts began thinking about serve mechanics, about the value of height in developing young players, and about how much a single elite weapon could offset an otherwise incomplete game. Players like Isner, Riley Opelka, and other towering servers who came after Karlovic owe at least part of their own tactical blueprints to the path he carved out first. Proof that a career built almost entirely around dominating service games, rather than complete all-court mastery, could genuinely thrive at the highest level of the sport. There's also something worth remembering about longevity here. Karlovic was 35 years old, well past the age most players are considered competitive threats against the game's elite, when he beat Djokovic in Doha. He continued competing into his late 30s, a testament to just how sustainable a serve-dependent game plan could be for a player whose body wasn't built for the physically taxing, movement-heavy style most modern champions rely on. For Djokovic specifically, those losses to Karlovic never derailed his career or his legacy in any meaningful way. He went on to become, by nearly every measure, the most statistically decorated player the sport has ever produced. But those results remain a fascinating footnote in an otherwise dominant career, proof that even the greatest player of his generation, at the peak of his powers, could still be beaten by the right physical outlier, on the right day, executing the one thing he did better than literally anyone else who ever picked up a racket. There's something genuinely fitting about the fact that Ivo Karlovic never won a Grand Slam, never reached the sport's highest echelon of trophies and records, and yet remains one of the most talked about, most respected names whenever tennis fans discuss the players who were nearly impossible to face on their best day. Greatness in tennis usually gets measured in Grand Slam titles, in weeks spent at world number one, in career-defining rivalries that stretch across a decade. By every one of those traditional measures, Karlovic's career looks modest, even ordinary, sitting alongside the legends of his era. But there's another kind of legacy in this sport. The legacy of being genuinely, uniquely unsolvable, even for a handful of matches, even against the very best player the world had ever seen. Novak Djokovic beat almost everyone. He built the most statistically dominant career men's tennis has ever produced, a resume that will likely stand as the benchmark for the sport for generations. And yet, twice, on a tennis court, against a towering Croatian journeyman who most casual fans could barely name, that dominance simply didn't apply. Not because Djokovic played poorly, because some physical outliers, on the right day, executing their singular gift at its absolute peak, are simply beyond what even the greatest players in history can solve. That's the real story of Ivo Karlovic. Not a champion in the traditional sense. Something rarer, in some ways. The giant who walked onto a court unlike almost anyone else the sport had ever seen, and who, for a few unforgettable matches, made even the most complete player of his generation look for once genuinely human. Not every legend needs a trophy case to prove they belonged. If this gave you a new appreciation for Ivo Karlovic, hit subscribe. We tell the stories other channels skip.